welcome to Canadian Justice. I'm Christine Van Geyn, and today we're talking about a controversial federal government program called the Court Challenges Program. Under this program, the federal government pays to sue itself on your dime. The Court Challenges Program offers federal taxpayer funding to certain charter challenges. The program is essentially the government handing taxpayer dollars to lawyers and activists to sue them. The program has been through many cycles of being created, canceled, recreated, recanceled, recreated again, all by successive liberal and conservative governments. And now, quietly working through its way through Parliament is a private member's bill, Bill C-316, that would make the program permanent. It would embed the controversial Court Challenges Program directly into legislation. Now, I've written about why I think this program is such a bad idea in an online publication called The Line, and the charity that I work for, the Canadian Constitution Foundation, has testified at Heritage Committee about why the whole project needs to be scrapped. So I obviously have a perspective. Now, here today are two experts who also have strong views about this program, Aaron Woodrick of the Macdonald-Laurier Institute and Ian Brody, professor at the University of Calgary. Thank you both so much for joining me today. Now, I gave an explanation of the program. Aaron, let's start with you. What can you add to this explanation, how this program works? Maybe you can tell us, like, what types of lawsuits actually get funded.
Yeah, I think a lot of people, they think the idea of standing up for rights sounds really good, but the reality is this program is very limited in the types of rights that can be litigated. Also, the fact that you mentioned that it's had a very checkered history in terms of being canceled and brought back to life suggests it's a bit of a political football. And indeed, and I know this because of Ian's fine submission to committee, the very birth of the program itself it was based on politics. It was Pierre Trudeau's sort of workaround because he didn't want to attack the Quebec government directly. So he created this program in order to bankroll other groups to do it, which in a way may be clever, but I think points out that this is not really about rights. This is about a political dodge and governments trying to outsource dealing with thorny issues that they're not willing to deal with themselves.
Yeah, Professor Brody, let's talk about that. The way the program is normally portrayed by many about its history, the narrative of the program, is that it was created originally by Pierre Elliott Trudeau to help advocate for language rights through these funding third-party litigation across the country. But, this narrative leaves a little to be desired. What's the real story there?
Yeah, I mean, it has a kernel of truth to it, of course, Christine, which is why the story persists. The program was set up in 1978. At the time, the Parti Québécois government had just taken office in Quebec and had brought in what we now refer to as Bill 101, so a big piece of legislation to try to limit the use of French inside Quebec, to limit people's ability to register their kids in English language schools, to limit the use of English in the legislature of Quebec and in the courts, and then probably most famously, to limit commercial businesses' ability to use English on their public signage. Trudeau thought this was a threat to national unity. He thought this was a threat to his vision of a national bilingual country, bilingual from coast to coast, which of course it was. And some parts of it were probably unconstitutional at the time. And the PQ probably knew this at the time when they introduced the legislation. They were, in a certain sense, hoping for a confrontation with the federal government. And Trudeau refused to, he thought about suing, the federal government suing the Quebec government to have the legislation overturned in the courts. He thought about using the old disallowance power to have the legislation disallowed. We know this, all of the cabinet documents have been released now because this is so long ago. And he decided that was too risky. His cabinet was anxious about taking the bait from the PQ by launching a court case directly. So instead, as Aaron says, they came up with this idea, we'll pay other people. So we'll use federal money to encourage the creation of English language rights groups in Quebec. And then we'll use federal money to pay those groups. It's kind of the original AstroTurf, right? We won't wait for the organization to be created. We'll go out and use federal money to spur the creation of the group, and then use federal money to sue it. So you get this idea, the Court Challenges Program supporters are always saying, we're paying people to hold the government to account and to assert people's individual rights. Well, let's be clear here. You're using government money in a government-approved way to pursue rights or to pursue claims in court that the government wants to be pursued in
Right.
court. That's a different thing
I mean,
than
that's not
what the
quite,
CCF does, for
yeah,
example.
that's not quite the way we would typically understand government accountability. We've got to go to commercial break now, but when we come back, I want to talk about the types of cases that the Court Challenges program takes now. Welcome back to Canadian Justice, where we're talking about the controversial Court Challenges program, where the federal government pays activists to sue them using your money. Now, Aaron, there's sort of two streams in the Court Challenges program. One stream relates to this more historic language rights stream of cases, and then the other are human rights cases. What can you tell me? What type of cases might that entail? What charter rights are being litigated in that stream of cases?
Well, one of the things about what's notable here, Christine, is that if you're going to have a program about defending charter rights, why pick only two streams, right? There are many rights in the charter. Again, we come down to why this program is controversial in the first place. And I think it's the fact that it's very selective in the rights that it wants to subsidize people to litigate on. So if you're going to have a program that is defending rights, why not have one, for example, that allows people to defend the right to free speech or the right to practice their religion?
So those would
right?
be covered under the Court Challenges human rights stream, and then I think equality rights is another group of rights that are covered as well. But it's not everything. You're absolutely correct that you can't bring charter claims for every protected ground under the charter. But the way the program operates that's interesting to me is it's a group of politically selected individuals who sit on an expert panel, and they choose which cases will actually get funding. Do we know, Ian, anything about the cases that are approved for funding? And if we don't know anything, why not?
Well, back when I first started working on this in the early 1990s, you could find out exactly what the Court Challenges program was funding and what it wasn't. So you could go through all of the funding decisions that they went through and see how, have an idea of how they were deciding which of the many cases that are launched each year deserve federal funding and which didn't. I think as a result of the research work that I was doing back then, this is 25 years ago now, the Court Challenges program stopped publishing and now refuses to publish the details of who they're funding and who they're not funding while the cases are going through the courts. So as a result, I think this is a serious problem for the renewal of the program, is the sort of the black hole of public money that's involved here, where you have a set of, as you say, expert panels, but they're appointed by the federal government, operating underneath a cloak of secrecy, using money secretly to support certain sides in court cases and certain sides not. Now, it's still possible if you scratch around a bit. You can tell the groups that are represented on the panel are the traditional social justice groups that you might see in the news on other issues. I think it's notable that we haven't found a single instance where the Court Challenges program was involved in any of the challenges during the pandemic on the big challenges to civil liberties and the big challenges to equality rights that arose during the course of all of the lockdowns and other COVID era regulations. So, for example, the church groups who found that they were being discriminated against compared to casinos and commercial businesses, I haven't found a single case where there was a church group that got Court Challenges program money to assert their equality of religion under the charter. When in fact, but it looks like there's a whole slew of homeless groups and gender ideology groups and so forth that do have Court Challenges program support. And I think that's the kind of political choice the program makes that gets it into trouble. It gets it into trouble every time.
Yeah, so obviously I work at a charity that does civil rights, civil liberties litigation. We do not take money from the federal government through this Court Challenges program. Aaron, what do you think that says about the effectiveness of private public interest litigation organizations to actually do the job of holding government to account?
Well, it proves that it's possible. Your organization in particular is very effective at this. There's other groups like the Civil Liberties Association, many other groups that are able to raise money from interested parties to litigate these things. So it's not as if, I mean, the supporters of the Court Challenges program almost assert that if we don't have this program, these issues will never get before a court, but they will. And I think, ensuring that there's skin in the game from private participants, helps us ensure that it's not just a bunch of political appointees in a back room making a decision. Since these are political appointees, it will come as no surprise to people that they tend to reflect the political preferences of the government of the day. And so the types of cases that the government doesn't want to see challenged will not get challenged.
Yeah, I mean, thank you for the compliments, but yes, obviously we've had some extremely successful litigation as public interest litigants doing charter challenges without the need for a program like this. We don't need taxpayer dollars to do that type of work. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Canadian Justice, where we're discussing the controversial court challenges program, where the federal government gives taxpayer dollars to advocates and lawyers to sue the federal government. So using your own money, you're using your money to sue the government. Now, one of the questions I had is about this bill C316, Aaron. This is a private member's bill. The objective of it is to entrench this court challenges program into legislation. Do you think that's a good idea or a bad idea? Because this has been a political football. It has gone back and forth so many times. You almost lose track. Is it better just to fix this program and make it permanent?
No, well, first of all, the idea of entrenching this program in legislation, I mean, that it would be binding a future government. So yes, it would require an extra step for a government to get rid of it if they want to by changing legislation. But I think it's silly to try and pretend that by entrenching this, you guarantee that it's never going to go away. So I think that's a bit of a dodge. It's governments, attempt to do this as a way to signal that they think the program is very important, which is all fine and good, but a future government might feel differently. So I think the very fact they're trying to entrench this is a distraction. I think it's better to focus on whether the program is good or not, whether it's functioning properly or not. I personally don't think we need the program, but if we are going to keep the program, certainly there's some improvements that could be made.
Ian, you were the chief of staff to Prime Minister Stephen Harper, and Harper was one of the politicians who repealed this program, and then he partially reinstated it for some limited cases. Were you involved in that process, and can you explain why he repealed it, and maybe what you think of this private member's bill to put it as a permanent piece of the Heritage Act?
Well, I have to be a little bit careful about talking about what I did in government because some of this is cabinet discussions. There's a 30-year rule about having them become public. But yes, the Harper government announced the cancellation of the court challenges program in the fall of 2006 as part of a overall budget trimming exercise, with the idea that the court challenges program had at that point outlived its usefulness. That at some point you might have said, well, we need to maybe kickstart the process of public interest litigation in Canada. But as Aaron's pointed out, there's now quite a vibrant ecosystem for public interest litigation in Canada. And of course, on the criminal rights side, provincial governments through legal aid programs pay for all sorts of assertion of charter criminal rights. I agree with Aaron about this particular piece of legislation. It's a symbolic piece of legislation because a future government could just have it repealed. There's no requirement. The requirement that the program exists, but no program that the government finance the program at a particular level. So this is a bit of a grandstanding by the private members that are backing the legislation. That said, I think it's a good opportunity to think through for future governments, what would they do with the court challenges program? The Harper government canceled it. The Morley government canceled it. But a future government might want to repurpose the program for other purposes. I mean, there are other constitutional rights that we've had trouble financing court cases around in the past. And so I think about Section 121 Inter-provincial free trade section of the British North America Act. There are court cases about the movement of beer and liquor between provinces.
A case that we at the
I think it'd be
Canadian
helpful to have more
Constitution.
litigation like that. You can
we
use a
were
court
involved in
challenges
that.
program in the future to encourage that.
So one of the things that stands out to me, Aaron, is that we talked about these expert panels are appointed by the Minister of Heritage as a political actor appointing these people. So do you think that that should make us concerned about a lack of viewpoint diversity on the expert panels who actually pick which cases get funding, if these appointments are political?
Well, it absolutely should concern us, and compounded by the lack of transparency around what's accepted and not, it makes it very difficult to maintain the fiction that these are going to be, the applications are going to be assessed in any kind of objective way. So I think at a bare minimum, and I know these again, riffing off some of Ian's recommendations through the committee, if you're going to have these committees, you should guarantee that, for example, opposition parties have the ability to appoint people onto those committees to ensure some viewpoint diversity and transparency. I mean, if the public cannot know which types of cases are being successful in getting funding, there's no way to measure whether or not there's any bias in the system. We need that information to be able to make an appropriate judgment about whether the program is being run in a biased way or not.
Yeah, I mean, one of the craziest examples I gave in an article I wrote was that the program funded interveners in the Harper and Canada case, a freedom of expression case. They funded interveners that supported the government. I mean, that's not even government accountability. That's just government funding third parties to defend the government. It's wild to me. We've got to go to break, but we'll be right back. Welcome back to Canadian Justice, where we're discussing the controversial court challenges program, which is when governments pay to sue themselves on taxpayer dime. So, Ian, there's a proposal at Heritage Committee it's a private member's bill that's now at committee to make this program permanent, to entrench it in legislation. And you testified at this committee, you made written and oral submissions. So one of the things that you mentioned was this issue that the federal government could potentially use this program to sue provincial governments. Can you explain why that would be a concern for you? Especially since, my understanding is that the expert committee says that they don't give funding for claims against provincial governments. So what's your concern here?
Yeah, and I should say I'm not contesting the expert committee's view here, but the legislation doesn't clarify this in its proposal to entrench the program in the Canadian Heritage Act, which I think should be a core principle here. The problem is, one of the areas of the charter that you can exploit with court challenges program money is the guarantee of English and French minority language education rights, and if that's a very active area of litigation. Of course, all of those court cases involve using federal money to sue provincial, usually education departments and local school boards to expand their French language or English language offerings in Quebec or outside of Quebec. And I just think that is a use of federal spending power that should be restricted. I have a long-standing view on this. The federal government should stay out of provincial jurisdiction with its spending power. And this is a way of kind of bypassing the public to make it look like this is a community interest group, but in fact, it's a community interest group with a chunk of federal funding going after a provincial government to expand their education offerings. I just think that is a battle that should be cut off in the legislation itself.
Yeah, Aaron, what's your take on that? Why do you think people should, be wary of this risk or potential for the federal government to fund third parties to sue provincial governments? Why is that a dangerous thing from a division of powers perspective?
Well, yeah, first of all, it creates a very antagonistic environment between the feds and the provinces. I mean, the feds could essentially use this as a stick to beat the provinces over the head with if they have a political beef with the provinces. I think, as Ian says, it doesn't respect division of powers. I mean, it would be amusing if the provinces retaliated and sort of set up their own programs encouraging, people to sue federal government on charter grounds. So I think it's, as Ian says, it's something we should probably barge pull away from. We have enough interregional conflict in this country. We don't need another thing added to the mix.
I mean, the federal government can sue provinces over laws they think are unconstitutional. They don't need to have this fig leaf of pretending it's a community group doing it when really they're the ones funding it. If they have a problem, they should come out and say it, and that involves bearing the political cost of a federal-provincial dispute. So I absolutely share that concern. Even if the committees say they don't do it, it's concerning that this private members bill doesn't explicitly prohibit that risk. Now, Aaron, as I said, this issue is controversial. This program is controversial, and a completely uncontroversial figure, Mr. Conrad Black, has written a column in the National Post about it. And he says that this program fleeces taxpayers. And frankly, I do share the concern that, you know, with the federal budget being what it is and the cost of living being what it is, that it seems outrageous that the government would use tax dollars to sue itself. What's your take?
Yeah, look, it's wrong in principle, but in a world where we have a big budget deficit, and there's 1,000 things to look for to cut, this is probably low-hanging fruit. I think most Canadians would say, yeah, we can't afford the government we have now. I really don't understand why the government is paying other people to sue itself.
Yeah. Ian, anything to add there in 30 seconds?
No, I think that's right. And plus, every court case that the Court Challenge Program funds here, as far as I can tell, is a court case to expand the size of government using the charter itself. So it's not, there aren't any of these court cases that are trying to shrink government. They're always in one direction.
Yeah, that's the problem with the lack of viewpoint diversity on those politically appointed expert committees. Ian Brody, Aaron Woodrick, thank you so much for coming on to share your perspective on this program.
Great to see you, Christine.
Cheers.
We've heard today about the Court Challenges program and a plan to entrench it into legislation and perhaps make it permanent. What do you think of the government handing out money so it can be sued? Is this an important accountability measure? Or is it naive to believe the government will hold itself to account? Should the program be scrapped or made permanent? You be the judge. Thanks for watching, and remember, a freer Canada starts with you.